The Booker Prize long list has been announced and we have a lot to talk about. Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader and I'm going to give you a breakdown of the long list for this year's Booker Prize. After a lot of speculation, we finally know the 13 books that have been listed for this year's prize out of 151 books that were submitted. And I'm here at Booker HQ to give you a breakdown of the prize, but also my honest feelings about the long list as a whole. A few of the books I'm very happy to see on the list and that I've read, and several of the books I'm really excited to read. A couple of the books I'm not so sure, I'm slightly questionable, but yeah, I'll get into all that in a minute. So first I'm going to give an overview of the list as a whole and break it down, and we can have a good chat about it. So one thing to note is this year, of course, it is just called the Booker Prize, not the Man Booker Prize anymore, because the sponsorship for the prize is changed. So it's just, a good clean title. Like I said in my predictions list, and by the way, I predicted 11 books out of the 13 on the list. I mean, I talked about over 100, so it's, not too big a surprise that I got a lot of them right. But yeah, there are 2 books on the list that I wasn't quite expecting. One by Salman Rushdie that I didn't even know was being published until Britta Bowler commented in that prediction video. And then there's also My Sister the Serial Killer, which I just wasn't expecting to see on this year's list. So looking over the group of books, there are 8 books by women, and that's sort of not a surprise. There are 4 female judges on the panel and 1 male judge. And so I was sort of expecting and hoping to see, a sort of female heavy list of authors on this year's prize list. And we have 2 former winners of the prize, that is Margaret Atwood and Salman Rushdie. So it'll be interesting to see if they win the prize again, although, there's not some, sort of old-time favorites like Ian McEwan and Howard Jacobson, who had new novels out that were eligible, and they haven't appeared on this list, which I'm sort of glad about because I wasn't too interested in reading either of their novels. And there are 5 novels on the list from independent publishers, and most notably from Galley Beggar Press, this novel by Lucy Ellmann called Ducks, Newburyport. And I talked about this in my prediction list, and this is a book that I bought recently that I've been very excited to read because it's been getting a lot of buzz and excitement. It's this novel over 1,000 pages long, and it's quite notable that Galley Beggar Press has a novel on this year's long list because they publish really interesting fiction. But one of their big notable books is that they published Eimear McBride, and who went on to win the Women's Prize for fiction. And so they're known for taking a punt on authors and novels that can't find any other presses that'll publish them. I mean, famously, Eimear McBride submitted her novel to many publishers and was rejected many times, and then went on to win this prize and be a big bestseller. And so yeah, and I can imagine that not many publishers would be willing to take on a novel that's over 1,000 pages long and is a bit challenging because it's apparently only written in 8 sentences. But yeah, it's great to see some independent publishers represented on this year's list. And then there is only 1 debut novel on the list, which of course again is this novel, My Sister the Serial Killer. And and I just sort of talking about overall, like it to be the only debut novel on the list. Usually there's quite a few other debut novels because this prize really gives attention to authors that haven't been published before, and so it's quite good when they include debut novels. And so I just sort of feel that this book has got a lot of attention already. When it was first published at the beginning of this year, a lot of people reading it and talking about it, and then it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize as well. And so, this is a book, that I would say doesn't really need all that much more attention, and that shouldn't really matter if the judges think it's a great book and worthy of attention. But, I just I like to see books that are championed that haven't got as much attention. And there's some other debut novels like Damien Barr's novel You Will Be Safe Here, which I've talked about before and is one of my favorite novels of the year so far, as well as The Doll Factory and Boy Swallows Universe, which is a novel I just read, an Australian novel debut that is really exciting and good, and there's no Australian fiction on this year's Booker list. So I just sort of feel like out of all the debut new fiction published in the past year, this is the one that they want to highlight. And, you know, I don't want to, like, dump on this novel because it's a good novel. It's really entertaining and well crafted and really well done. But yeah, I just sort of looking at the list as a whole, this stands out as the only debut novel, I think. And looking at the list as a whole, you know, it's quite notable in terms of nationality that it's a very UK-centered list. I mean, there's a Canadian author and an Irish author, 2 Nigerian authors and a Mexican author. So, you know, it is fairly well balanced. And of course, you know, you can't get all the nationalities in, although it's quite notable that there's only one US novel on the list, you know, and that's this big one, Ducks Newburyport, that I was talking about. So, you know, in past years, sort of, there's been a lot of much more US published authors on the list, and so, yeah, quite interesting that this is the only one that's listed, and this author currently lives in Scotland, so. But then looking at the list as a whole, I'm, you know, quite happy with it and quite excited for it because there's several authors on this list who I think are really well accomplished but haven't got the wide-scale recognition that some other, you know, more famous authors have. So it's good to see that, you know, other people are going to be discovering their fiction for the first time and reading these authors I think really deserve more attention. And just like personally, like selfishly, several of these books I've been really wanting to get to, so this gives me a good excuse to actually read them. And also it's notable that 2 novels on the list directly reference classic novels. So there's Salman Rushdie's novel Quixote, and then there is Jeanette Winterson's novel Frankissstein, so playing upon Don Quixote and Frankissstein. And, you know, I kind of like that there's novels on the list that harken back to classic novels, directly referencing them. It makes you want to go back to these classic novels as well as reading, you know, these new permutations. And then also an Orchestra of Minorities, this sort of plays upon the tale of the Odyssey and gives a different sort of modern version of it. And I'm going to go into the novels now and break them down and give summaries and talk about the ones I'm most excited to read and ones that I have read and that I would really recommend. So to start off, we have to talk about Margaret Atwood and her novel The Testaments, which is of course the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And I don't have a copy of The Testaments here because it is strictly under wraps. This is like heavily embargoed novel, which hasn't been published yet. It won't be published until September 10th. And this is an interesting issue because 3 of the novels on the long list haven't actually been published yet. So there's The Testaments, and there's Deborah Levy's novel, and Salman Rushdie's novel. And Salman Rushdie and Deborah Levy, they're scheduled to be published at the end of August. And I wouldn't be surprised with these 2 novels that because they've now been longlisted for the prize, the publishers might rush them and bring them out in the next week or 2 so that people will have a chance to read them before the shortlist announcement on September 3rd. But with The Testaments, now I don't think the publishers are going to rush that because this is a big publishing event, and I made a whole video when it was first announced that Margaret Atwood was writing the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. I made a video back in December talking about the news of the sequel and what we all think and feel about there being a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And the judges for this prize have been warned that it's strictly embargoed, and all they're saying is that spoiler discretion and a ferocious non-disclosure agreement prevent any description of who, how, why, and even where. So it's terrifying and exhilarating. That's all they're gonna say about The Testaments. And all we've been given as a plot summary so far to hint about it is that The Testaments is set 15 years after Offred's final scene in The Handmaid's Tale, and it's gonna be narrated from the perspective of 3 different women. So that's all we know about it. And, you know, and I mean, I guess it's just sort of like building excitement for the publication of it because obviously this is massively famous, influential novel. But, you know, I'm kind of happy because I've been wanting to reread The Handmaid's Tale, and so I've decided I'm going to do it. I'm going to reread The Handmaid's Tale in preparation for reading The Testaments because I read this quite a long time ago, and, you know, and this has become such a part of our popular culture. It's there's the TV series, but also it's heavily referenced in like a lot of politics and protest march. On several different protests, women have dressed as handmaidens to give a silent protest to legislation trying to restrict women's bodies. So this novel is so well known, but to go back to the actual text of it, I think there's a lot of things in the actual original novel that we've forgotten. And so I'm very excited to reread this. I mean, who else is up for a rereading of The Handmaid's Tale before The Testaments comes out? But but like I said, I don't think we're going to see The Testaments before its scheduled publication date on September 10th. So it might get on the shortlist or might not on September 3rd. And of course, Margaret Atwood has won the prize before, not for The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale was shortlisted before, but didn't win the prize that year. She won the prize for her novel The Blind Assassin in the year 2000. So it'd be sort of funny if The Testaments won. It'd be sort of redemption for The Handmaid's Tale not winning the Booker Prize in the year that it was first published. Next we have the novel Nightboat to Tangier by Irish author Kevin Barry. And like I said before, Kevin Barry is an author I really enjoy, and so I find it quite endearing whenever an Irish author is listed for a book prize. All of like literary Irish Twitter goes crazy, and so there have been lots of posts this morning already like yay, Kevin Barry, our good Irish man is up for the Booker Prize, and but yeah, his last novel Beetlebone I loved, and that novel won the Goldsmiths Prize, which is a prize for experimental fiction. And this novel is about two aging gangsters who are in a Spanish port waiting for a boat to go to Tangier, and so they have a long discussion and talk about their history and one of their daughters, and so looking at it from the outside, that plot summary, that doesn't draw me in. But what does draw me in is that it is written by Kevin Barry, because he's a really interesting, like playful, fun writer who does write with a sort of experimental edge. Like Beetlebone was about John Lennon traveling across Ireland in this sort of surreal adventure to go to this island that he bought for himself. And his writing is filled with so much humor, but as well as like funny, clever insights about the modern world and lots of plays on language. And it's just, yeah, really interesting, good writer. So I am very excited to read this. And then My Sister, the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. And yeah, I don't want to like downplay this novel, because it is really great read, very entertaining, as well as like clever and like saying something meaningful and emotional about the how women are perceived and treated, like especially women in modern day Nigeria. But it's also a really entertaining, like plot-driven novel, very suspenseful. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. And like I said when I was talking about the Women's Prize, and when this was shortlisted for the Women's Prize, I'm very happy I read this novel, but I can't help thinking, like, does it need more attention? A lot of people have read this novel already, but this may be the judge's way of saying that they think there's more here that we should explore. So if you haven't read it, I would really recommend reading this novel, because you will really enjoy it. But yeah, personally, I would have rather seen some other debuts on the list. And as I've already mentioned briefly, Ducks Newburyport. So this is a novel set in America and is about a housewife reflecting back on her life and the state of America today, and quite at length. There's quite a few big sort of chunksters on the list this year. But this is a novel also that's meant to have a lot of humor and sort of Joycean wordplay. I mean, it's sort of like extended monologue. So yeah, it's sort of playing on that Ulysses theme. And it's a novel that, like I've talked about in recent videos, I'm just very eager to read. Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. And this is a novel, like I was talking about, she's a British novelist who's published a lot of fiction, done a lot of journalism, and work in the literary community. She's very well respected, but I've never read any of her fiction. I'm so happy this gives me a good excuse to finally read one of her novels, and this is meant to be a great novel. So it's the story about 12 different characters, many of them women who are Black and British, and talking about their different experiences. Some of their stories cross over with each other, some of them don't, but it's a novel in verse, so that's something different, and it is one just that I'm very excited to read. The Wall by John Lanchester, and this is a novel that was published earlier this year and that I have been wanting to get to because I've never read anything by John Lanchester before. He's a writer who was actually born in Germany but has lived in the UK for many years, and he published a novel called Capital several years ago, which was very popular and was made into a BBC series. And this novel, The Wall, deals with contemporary British politics in a very explicit way, because it's a sort of dystopian novel set in the near future where the borders of the UK have been blocked off. So, really making a dialogue with the current issues to do with the UK leaving the European Union. And it's about a man who patrols this wall, trying to protect it from others coming into the country. So it's dealing with the issue of immigration, but is also, as a story, meant to be a thriller. So I am quite excited to read this as well. The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy. And the plot of this novel is quite eccentric, as a lot of Deborah Levy's fiction is. Now, she's been shortlisted for the prize before, and her fiction is really interesting. She also writes these kind of autobiographical books as well, and this novel is about a man who in 1989 is hit by a car on Abbey Road, but he's not seriously harmed, and he just sort of goes about his life. But then again, much later, I think in 2016, he's back on Abbey Road and he's hit by a car again, this time seriously injured, and so it's just sort of the story of his life, and it's quite a wild plot. But one that I'm really eager to delve into. Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, and this is a Mexican writer who, in the past, she's written several books before, written them all in Spanish, and this is her first novel that she's written in English. And I just love this novel so much. It has a really interesting structure to it. It's basically a road trip novel about a family traveling across the United States and gathering sounds around the country, but also exploring the sort of immigrant experience in the United States. And the second half of the novel goes into this other storyline about several children who are traveling by train to try to enter the country. So it's an incredibly thoughtful novel, talking a lot about politics, but also just about family life. And so it's sort of about the bond of family. Really beautifully written. I just love this novel so much, and I was disappointed it wasn't shortlisted for the Women's Prize. It would be great if this could be shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year. An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma, and this is his second novel, I believe. It's the first novel of his that I've read, and I had mixed feelings about this novel. It's about a Nigerian farmer who has a fairly ordinary life, but it's narrated in a really unique way because it's narrated from the perspective of his spirit guide, who's called his Chi, who sort of observes his life and intervenes now and then in his decisions. And he falls in love with a woman, and he decides, in order to win the respect of this woman's family, he needs to enroll in a university in Cyprus. And sort of tragedy falls out after that. And I thought it was really uniquely written. It was a very moving novel, written from this very unique perspective. But I found that slightly irritating, some parts of how that was narrated. Like I've said before when I've talked about this novel, his spirit guide comes across as arrogant at sometimes, because he constantly repeats this phrase that I like, oh yes, of course he's acting this way, because I've seen this many times before. But it is a really meaningful story, and actually the latter half of this novel is really interesting, I think, because it gets into this whole moral dilemma of his. So I did find it very moving, and to take the stance of his spirit guide to talk about this ordinary man's life of somebody that we don't ordinarily hear about, and who's sort of advocating his spirit guide is sort of standing up for him in this trial of amongst these sort of gods and these different spirits, and so to have a spirit guide sort of defending him, when in ordinary reality people like this, a character like this, he wouldn't get much support from people around him, although surprisingly he does encounter a lot of kindness awareness and people who want to help him. So, it is a really interesting novel, but I felt it did have some issues and it just didn't move me as it has moved some other people. I mean, I know I've heard from some other people who this is their favorite novel of the year. So, if you want to try it, then give it a whirl and see what you think. Lanny by Max Porter, and I talked about recently how I think Max Porter is one of the most exciting writers in Britain today. This is his second novel. For his first novel, Grief is the Thing with Feathers, he won the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year award, and he uses a very experimental, interesting form of fiction, but packed with emotion and really commenting on the politics of modern Britain. And this novel is set in a small British town and involves a family and is told from their different perspectives, focusing mainly on a young boy who's very sensitive and artistic and has this attachment to a local mythologized figure called Dead Papa Toothwort. And it's written in this very eccentric style where you can see sometimes the narrative just jumps around like this. So quite wild and fun, but the whole novel isn't like that. It gets into some of their stories and is much more straightforward narrative in other sections of the novel. And I saw Max Porter give an interesting performance of this. He didn't give a reading, it was like a performance. He got some actors on stage to read the different parts of the characters. There's also a local artist who's one of the main characters in this novel. And it was such a unique experience, a really different way to experience a novel than just a straightforward reading. And there's been theatrical performances of his first novel, Grief is a Thing with Feathers, as well. So I like that it's fiction that is bleeding out beyond the page and into these different mediums as a way to experience his really unique stories. So I would highly recommend this novel if you want to give Max Porter a try. 10 minutes, 38 seconds in This Strange World by Elif Shafak. I don't actually have a physical copy of this novel, so I'll put a picture of it up here. But this is a novel that I've been really wanting to read, as well as I read her previous novel and really enjoyed and appreciated it. And it sounds like a really powerfully emotional novel. It's told from the perspective of a woman who's a former prostitute, who's at the end of her life, and she's sort of reflecting on her experiences and how she got to this point. But Elif Shafak is a really striking and important literary figure in the community as well, because she's an author in her native Turkey who's been put on trial for what she's written, and she's been accused of insulting Turkishness. And she wrote a really powerful article recently, which I'll link in the description below, talking about how the Turkish government is really clamping down on academics and writers, and especially women who speak out against the current Turkish government. And so it's a really powerful article. I'd really encourage you to read it. So, she's a really important figure in our community, but also a very active figure in the literary community, because she's been a judge on multiple prizes recently, multiple prizes this year. But I have read also how her novel is really powerful, so I'm very eager to read this novel as well. Then there is Quixote by Salman Rushdie, and yes, this is playing on Don Quixote, which is a novel which, if you've never read Don Quixote, I'd really encourage you to read it, because it's a really funny novel. Like I've mentioned before in previous videos how I like to read aloud to my partner, and once we went on a road trip across Spain and I was reading aloud to him from Don Quixote, and honestly we were laughing aloud so much because it's a really funny novel. And so Salman Rushdie, he does a modern take on this story about a man who is a aging salesman who falls in love with a TV presenter, and he travels across America in a quest to convince this TV presenter that they're meant to be together. And so it's sort of about his delusions, but also commenting on modern America. So I've never been too excited about reading Salman Rushdie's books before, but I am very excited to read this one. And finally, we have Frankissstein by Jeanette Winterson, and of course a play on the novel Frankissstein. And I actually read the novel Frankissstein for the first time last year. And it's one of these books that's another classic novel that's so much in our popular culture. You sort of feel like you know the story already, even if you haven't read the novel, although the original novel has a lot of surprises in it, and I was quite yeah, excited to experience the actual novel. And Jeanette Winterson is such an interesting writer. I mean, she's a very well-established literary figure. Most people know her for the novel Oranges Are the Only Fruit, but actually a lot of her other novel, which is a fairly straightforward novel, but a lot of her other novels are very experimental and playful with language and form. And so this novel plays a lot with gender, which is something she does a lot in her fiction. And it's about a transgender doctor who falls in love with a professor named Victor Stein. And it takes place in modern day Brexit Britain, so it's, commenting on modern politics. But the story, I believe, also goes back to Mary Shelley's time and talks about her writing the novel Frankissstein. So I think, it sounds like it has a really unique structure. And, Jeanette Winterson is an author that, like I said before, when I first came to Britain, I read a lot of her novels. I was very excited by her writing. I haven't read her books so much in recent years, but yeah, very interested to read this novel. So those are all the 13 books on the long list. Let me know what you think of the list in the comments below. I'm really eager to hear what you make of this list. Are you happy with the list? Were you hoping to see other books on the list? There are some noticeable omissions from the list. I think a lot of people were expecting to see Ali Smith's novel Spring on the list. I'm sort of hoping that next year, when Ali Smith publishes the final novel in her quartet, her seasonal quartet Summer, that this novel will be submitted for the prize and it'll just win all of the book prizes that year. But then, there are also novels like The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead that a lot of people were expecting to see on the list, and several other books as well. But yeah, let me know what you think of all of these books, which ones you're most eager to read now. And if you're interested in rereading The Handmaid's Tale alongside me, that would be really fun. But overall, I am very excited about this year's list. I'm probably going to begin reading these two novels. Not totally sure where I'm going to begin, but let me know in the comments below which books you want to start reading from the list. Are you going to read all of the long list this year, or are you going to wait for the short list and then maybe read something from that? I mean, I think I am going to have a go and read all of the long list because, like I said, all the novels that I haven't read on the list, I am quite eager to read them all, and a lot I've been meaning to get to. So, this gives me a good excuse. But of course, first I have to finish reading the novel that I'm currently reading, which is Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Blithedale Romance. I'm buddy reading this with Matthew Sharapa. It's another classic novel. But maybe Nathaniel Hawthorne will win the Booker Prize this year. You never know. But yeah, I do really like how this year's list is harkening back to a lot of classic fiction and making you want to go back and read some of these classic novels as well. But anyway, I've been rambling on long enough now, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll talk to you again soon.